Does every dad do this? 5 words whispered by a little girl in oversized shoes that shattered silence, exposed a hidden wound, and changed how a town defined love forever. The rain hadn't stopped since dawn. It fell in thin, almost invisible sheets, soaking the sidewalks of downtown Ashland, Oregon, and carrying with it the gray weight of early November. Officer Rachel Monroe had just finished her second cup of lukewarm station coffee when the front door creaked open. At first, no one noticed. The dispatch radio buzzed with chatter about a minor traffic jam on I-5. A rookie was re-inking the fingerprint pad in the corner. Rachel turned toward the door on instinct. Then she saw her. The girl couldn't have been older than 7. Her raincoat hung off one shoulder like it had never been buttoned properly. One sock was missing, her hair stuck to her cheeks, and her hands clutched a stuffed rabbit that looked older than she did. The only dry spot on her was the place where the rabbit's ear had been shielding her cheek. Rachel stood. "Sweetheart, are you lost?" The girl didn't answer. She walked slowly to the center of the room, as if her small body knew how to take up as little space as possible. Behind her, muddy footprints trailed across the tile floor. Officer Michael Bennett approached from the records office, his usual easy smile gone the moment he noticed her trembling. Rachel knelt down. "Can you tell us your name?" The girl blinked. Her bottom lip quivered. Then, barely audible, she whispered, "Does every dad do this?" The room fell silent. Not the polite kind of quiet. The kind that happens right before something breaks. Michael crouched beside Rachel. "What's your name, honey?" "Sophie," she said. "Sophie Parker." Rachel reached for her radio to call the Department of Human Services, but something in Sophie's posture stopped her. The way the girl flinched, not at the officers, but at the sound of the dispatch crackling back to life. "No rush," Michael murmured to Rachel. "Let's not make this harder than it already is." Sophie sat on a chair near the break room, the stuffed rabbit perched beside her like a quiet witness. Rachel brought her a warm cup of cocoa from the vending machine down the hall. Sophie stared at it without touching it. "I'm not supposed to take things without asking," she whispered. "You're not stealing," Rachel said gently. "This one's just for you." Still, Sophie didn't sip. Her eyes darted toward the door every few seconds. Her entire body looked like it was trying not to exist. Rachel took a slow breath. "Can you tell me what made you come here today?" Sophie's voice was barely more than air. "He said if I ever talked about things outside, he wouldn't be mad. He'd just stop talking to me." Michael sat beside her. "Who is he, Sophie?" "My dad. He's not mean. He's just—" She stopped. "He's quiet. So I thought, maybe all dads are like that." Rachel's throat tightened. "What do you mean by things?" Sophie's gaze fixed on her hands. Like when you don't get hugged even when you try your best. Or when you're sick and he puts medicine on the counter but doesn't ask how you feel. Or when he says, "I love you the way a father should," but never looks at you when he says it. Michael's brows furrowed, but he said nothing. Rachel felt the air thin around them. Sophie added, "When I started talking to the wall at home, he said I needed to practice independent thought. And when I cried, he said silence builds strength." She looked up, panicked now. "Am I in trouble? For telling? For talking to you?" Rachel shook her head, steady but warm. "You did exactly the right thing." Sophie's shoulders sagged in quiet relief. Michael asked, "Can we call someone for you? A family member? A teacher?" "No," Sophie said. "They'll call him. Then he'll know I talked. Then I'll get the silence. What do you mean? Rachel asked. If he finds out I said something, Sophie whispered, he won't yell. He won't even look at me. He'll just be gone, even if he's standing there. Rachel glanced at Michael. Both knew the signs. Emotional neglect was hard to prove. There were no bruises, no broken bones, just empty eyes and the invisible wreckage of unmet needs. Rachel excused herself to speak quietly with dispatch. Normally, a case like this would require immediate transfer to DHS custody, but a storm had flooded a section of the highway outside Medford, delaying the social worker's arrival until morning. Looks like she's staying with us tonight, Rachel said, returning with a blanket and a smile that didn't quite hide the ache in her chest. Sophie curled up on the small cot in the staff room, still holding the rabbit. Rachel sat beside her, watching the girl fight sleep like a soldier who feared what dreams might bring. I'm not used to people talking this much, Sophie whispered in the dark. Rachel smiled gently. Well, we're not used to people being this brave. Silence. Then Sophie asked, If my dad finds out I told, will he send me away forever? No, sweetheart, Rachel whispered. But you're not going back to being invisible. Outside, the rain kept falling. But inside that quiet police station in Ashland, for the first time in a long time, someone had listened. Someone had heard her. And for Sophie Parker, that changed everything. The drive to Eagle Point the next morning was silent. Officer Rachel Monroe sat beside Sophie in the back seat of the patrol car, though they weren't using sirens and no cuffs were involved. This wasn't an arrest. It was a return. Though what exactly Sophie was returning to felt more like a hollow shell than a home. The sky over southern Oregon still hung low with clouds, mist curling along the treetops. As they left the modest bustle of Ashland behind, the roads narrowed, and the houses grew farther apart. The air smelled of wet pine and something lonelier. Do you want to talk before we get there? Rachel asked gently. Sophie shook her head. Her small hand clutched the rabbit's torn ear tightly. Not like a toy, but like an anchor. The house on the hill appeared through the windshield, a pale gray structure with clean windows and no welcome mat. Every shutter aligned, every bush trimmed evenly. The yard looked like a picture in a manual on how to be sterile. Thomas Parker stood on the porch, dressed in slacks and a navy sweater, his posture straight, his eyes unreadable. A man who believed that chaos could be eliminated through order, and that silence was strength. Good morning, he said when Rachel stepped out. His voice was calm, polite, too polite. Mr. Parker? Rachel nodded, helping Sophie out of the car. Sophie stood still for a moment, then took 2 slow steps toward the porch. Thomas did not bend down to greet her. He didn't ask if she was okay. He simply held the door open and said, Breakfast is on the table. Rachel leaned closer to Sophie. Remember, this is temporary. 10 days. Supervised. You can talk to me anytime. Sophie nodded, then followed her father inside. The house was quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that presses in from the walls. No music, no scent of food, no photos on the mantel, not a single hand-drawn picture on the fridge. Thomas had always believed in independence-based parenting. After his wife Evelyn died in a car accident 3 years ago, he doubled down on his approach: minimal interference, maximum autonomy. Children must learn to self-soothe, he once told a grief counselor who had lasted 2 sessions. In the kitchen, a single plate of eggs and toast waited at Sophie's seat. He had already eaten. The paper was folded on the table beside a black coffee. Eat slowly, Thomas said. Chew 20 times per bite. Sophie sat, her fingers curled tightly around the fork. She didn't speak, neither did he. Halfway through the meal, her hands began to tremble. She remembered a winter 2 years ago. She had a fever so high she could barely walk. She knocked on his study door to ask for help. He'd said he was thinking and could not be disturbed. She'd gone back to her room, shivering. That night, she'd made herself a cold compress using a sock and snow from the porch railing. Thomas never knew. Or maybe he did, but thought it was a lesson in resilience. Later that afternoon, Sophie stood in her room. Nothing had changed since she left. The bed was still made with military corners. The bookshelf alphabetized. Even the stuffed animals were arranged in descending order by size, because consistency builds safety, her father had once explained. But there were no photos of her mother. Evelyn had been erased from the house like a smudge wiped off glass. Sophie walked to the closet, opened it, and stared at the dress her mother had sewn by hand, a pale yellow cotton dress with small blue flowers. Her mother used to hum while stitching. That sound was gone now, like everything else. At dinner, Thomas spoke only once. "You may read from the logic puzzle workbook after you finish." Sophie obeyed. She didn't ask to play. Didn't mention the rabbit she'd accidentally left in the patrol car. Didn't tell him that Officer Rachel had sung to her the night before. She simply finished her vegetables and opened the workbook to page 17. That night she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. She whispered softly, "Does every dad do this?" No answer came, only the sound of the HVAC system clicking on, humming mechanically. The next morning, Thomas reviewed Sophie's workbook with a red pen. "You solved this problem incorrectly. You skipped a step." "I thought I could figure it out in my head." "Thinking in silence is not the same as thinking correctly." Sophie nodded. She didn't cry. She never did here. On day 4, she dropped a glass by accident. It shattered. She froze. Her body remembered not screams, not slaps, but the sound of his shoes walking away, the silence that followed, the door to his study clicking shut. 3 days of no eye contact, no response. But today he just looked at her, said nothing, picked up a dustpan. Still, she whispered, "I'll clean it. I promise." He didn't stop her. Sophie was 5. She had drawn a picture. Her, holding hands with both parents, under a sky of hearts. She showed it to her father. He blinked once, then said, "That's not very realistic." She'd taken the picture to her room and never drawn again. Rachel called every evening to check in. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Sophie always answered. But she wasn't. She had learned how to mimic normalcy, how to say fine and okay and yes, while her insides curled up like old paper. On day 6, she sat by the window watching a robin flutter on the fence. Her fingers moved slowly on the glass, tracing the bird's path. Then, without thinking, she whispered, "Hi, Mom." It was the first time she had said it in a year. The moment the words left her lips, the silence felt less like a prison and more like a choice, one she no longer wished to make. The emotional trauma Sophie experiences is categorized as chronic emotional neglect, a form of psychological maltreatment where basic emotional needs like affection, validation, and attunement are systematically unmet. Unlike physical abuse, it leaves no bruises, but it rewires a child's sense of worth, safety, and belonging. Prolonged emotional deprivation can lead to attachment trauma, where the child feels invisible, undeserving of love, and hyper-aware of others' emotions to stay safe. On day 7, Sophie asked very softly, "Can I have toast with cinnamon tomorrow?" Thomas paused. That's a high-sugar item. But I'll check. It was the first maybe she had ever received from him. She didn't know whether to hope or stay neutral to avoid disappointment. That night, she dreamed of music, her mother's voice humming "You Are My Sunshine." When she woke, there were no tears, just a thought. What if silence isn't strength? What if silence is survival? And what if I don't want to survive anymore? What if I want to live? Sophie didn't speak on the drive to her new foster home, but she did hold Rachel's hand for a moment before the officer rang the bell. That small touch, quick and shy, said more than words could. The door opened to the warm smell of bread and lavender. Elena Whitaker smiled before speaking. "Hi, Sophie. I'm so glad you're here." Her husband, Mark, stood behind her, taller, quieter, wearing a green sweater and jeans, his eyes kind but careful. He looked like someone who had practiced smiling in a mirror but hadn't used it often in public. Sophie stepped inside slowly, clutching her rabbit to her chest, now clean and stitched up where the ear had torn. The house was filled with gentle clutter, books stacked sideways, half-colored drawings taped on the fridge, a crocheted blanket draped over a couch arm like it had just been used. It felt lived in. The hallway had framed photos, not posed, but candid moments. A boy chasing bubbles, a laughing girl missing a tooth, a dog curled between two pairs of muddy boots. Sophie paused in front of them, her eyes scanning each frame. Mark noticed and said quietly, "Those are our old foster kids. Some stayed a week, some longer. All of them left something behind." "Like what?" Sophie asked. It was the first thing she'd said since arriving. "Like drawings, recipes, made-up bedtime songs, or stories," Elena answered. "Sometimes just a dent in the couch cushion." "Did they all get adopted?" Sophie's voice was quiet. Elena's smile faded slightly, then returned. "Some. Others found their way back home. What matters is they knew they were safe while they were here." That night, Sophie was given a room with yellow curtains and a lamp shaped like the moon. On the nightstand was a little note in handwriting that wasn't Elena's or Mark's. "Dear new kid, I hope you like stars. If you're scared, hug the pillow. I pretended it was a space dog. Love, KC." Sophie ran her hand over the note like it might disappear. At dinner, the Whitakers talked about their day, how Mark had a double shift at the hospital, and Elena's third graders had decided they were all starting a kindness club. Sophie listened, unsure when she was supposed to speak. When Elena passed her a bowl of mashed potatoes and said, "Take as much as you want," Sophie only took a spoonful. She didn't ask for seconds. Didn't laugh when Mark made a corny joke about broccoli being tiny trees. Halfway through the meal, Elena leaned over and said, "Sophie, would you like some more juice?" Sophie stared down. "I didn't earn it," she whispered. "I only did one math page today. I didn't help with anything. I didn't—" Her voice cracked, then vanished. Mark set down his fork slowly. "You don't have to earn juice, sweetheart. Or mashed potatoes. Or kindness. Not here." Sophie nodded like she understood, but her hands were clenched beneath the table. That night she lay in bed staring at the moon lamp. When Elena came in to say goodnight, Sophie flinched. "I'm not sleepy yet," she blurted. Elena smiled. "That's okay. I just wanted to say sweet dreams." "You don't have to," Sophie said. "I know this is a job. I won't get mad if you forget." Elena's face softened. "Sophie, may I tell you a secret?" Sophie blinked. "When I was 8, my mom went away for a while. I had to live with my aunt. She was nice, but I kept thinking, if I enjoy being here too much, does that mean I don't love my mom? Sophie's eyes widened. Yes, she whispered. That's how it feels. Elena sat gently at the foot of the bed. But love doesn't work like that. It's not limited. It's not betrayal to feel safe. Sophie said nothing, but she didn't turn away either. The next morning she woke up to the smell of pancakes. Mark was in the kitchen flipping a heart-shaped one and humming to himself. He looked awkward doing it, like he was learning in real time. My first time making them without supervision, he said. Don't tell Elena. She's the pancake master. Sophie watched him closely. Aren't you supposed to be at work? Late shift today. I thought I'd make breakfast and ruin the kitchen before she gets back. Sophie sat at the counter, watching the batter drip down the side of the pan. My dad never made pancakes. Mark nodded. Mine didn't either. That hung in the air a second too long. Then Mark said, My dad left when I was 5. Took everything, even the dog. I didn't see him again until I was 24, and by then I didn't really care. Sophie looked up. Did it hurt? Like stepping on glass barefoot every morning. For a long time. Then it stopped bleeding, but the skin grew tougher. She hesitated. So, do you hate him? Mark thought for a moment. No. I just stopped waiting for something he never planned to give. Do you think I'm wrong? To still want my dad to notice me? Mark didn't answer immediately. He knelt so they were eye to eye. No, Sophie. Wanting love doesn't make you wrong. Giving love in a home without it. That's not weakness. That's the bravest thing I know. Sophie blinked quickly, like something inside was trying not to spill out. If I stay kind in a home with no kindness, she said, voice trembling, does that make me strong or foolish? Mark looked at her, his expression steady. Strong. But it doesn't mean you have to stay there forever. That evening, when Elena tucked her in, Sophie didn't flinch. She even whispered, Good night, before the door closed. Then she stared at the ceiling, whispering the question again, but not in fear this time, just curiosity. If I'm loved, do I deserve it? Or is this all a mistake? The next day, her therapist gave her a feelings chart. Sophie refused to point at any face. They don't match, she said. I feel more than one. And none of them. That's okay, the therapist said gently. That means you're waking up inside. On the third night, Sophie sat at the dinner table and, out of nowhere, began crying. No loud sobs, just tears falling steadily into her macaroni and cheese. Elena reached out. Sophie, what's wrong? The little girl looked up, voice breaking. I didn't earn this kindness. And that was the moment everything cracked. Elena pulled her chair closer, wrapped Sophie into a firm, quiet hug. You don't earn kindness. It's not a reward. It's a right. Sophie clung to her then, like a child holding on to a truth she had never believed was allowed. Outside, the wind rattled softly against the windows. But inside, for the first time in Sophie's life, she cried without shame, and no one turned away. No one said, stop. No one walked out of the room. No one went silent. And that night, when the moon lamp glowed above her bed, Sophie finally whispered back to the universe, I think I'm ready to feel safe. The courthouse in Jackson County was built of sandstone and time. It stood like an old watchman on the edge of downtown Medford, tall, stoic, and tired of the truths people tried to hide inside it. On the morning of Sophie Parker's preliminary custody hearing, the building hummed with routine. Bailiffs carrying files, clerks organizing paperwork, attorneys muttering to their clients under breath that barely held faith. Sophie walked in between Elena and Mark, her small hand buried in Elena's coat pocket. Her feet shuffled, not from fear exactly, but from something older. The instinct of a child who had learned early how to shrink herself before anyone asked her to. Judge Amelia Vaughn sat at the bench, her silver hair pulled into a tight bun, her face unreadable. To her right sat the court-appointed social worker, Ms. Kayla Jennings, who had finally met with Sophie just 2 days prior. And across the courtroom, in a gray suit that matched the color of the storm sky outside, sat Thomas Parker, straight-backed and silent. Not once did his eyes flicker toward Sophie. Not when she entered. Not when she sat down. Not even when she pulled her rabbit from her backpack and cradled it in her lap like armor. The legal debate began as expected. Thomas's lawyer, a well-spoken man with a thin mustache and thick briefcase, presented bank statements, letters of character, enrollment forms for a private STEM summer program, and a meticulously organized binder of photographs of the Parker home, none of which had people in them. "My client," the lawyer said, "has provided consistent material care for his daughter, stable shelter, nutrition, educational resources, and health care. While his parenting style may appear minimalist, it does not fall within the legal definition of abuse or neglect." Elena clenched her hands in her lap. Mark leaned forward slightly, whispering to her, "Watch what happens next." Judge Vaughn looked up. "Does the child wish to speak?" The room turned toward Sophie. Ms. Jennings shook her head gently. "Your Honor, at this stage, the child has not requested to testify." Sophie shrank slightly into Elena's side. But then a new voice spoke, clear, calm, and completely unexpected. "Your Honor," said a woman from the second row, "if I may." Everyone turned to see Ms. Danielle Rivers, a petite woman in her early 50s with a floral scarf and an unmistakable presence. Sophie gasped. "That's my music teacher," she whispered. "Ms. Rivers," Judge Vaughn said, eyebrows raised, "are you on the witness list?" "No, ma'am, but I received a message from Sophie's therapist yesterday. She mentioned that music had been a consistent emotional outlet for the child. I thought perhaps I could provide context." The judge studied her for a moment. "Proceed." Danielle approached the front of the room and placed a small speaker on the witness stand. "I don't have photos," she said, voice low but steady. "I don't have income records, but I do have this." She pressed play. A soft guitar began to strum. Not professional, just gentle. Then came the voice. Young, a little off-pitch, and full of longing. "You are my sunshine, my only sunshine." The room froze. Sophie's hands gripped the rabbit tighter. "You make me happy when skies are gray." Danielle spoke over the recording quietly. "Sophie asked to record this during recess. She told me her mother used to sing it. She said she wasn't allowed to hum at home anymore, so she wanted to keep the sound somewhere safe. You'll never know, dear, how much I love you." Thomas's face remained expressionless. "Please don't take my sunshine away." The final note wobbled slightly. The silence that followed felt thick enough to hold. Danielle stepped back. "I just thought you should know what silence sounds like." Judge Vaughn didn't speak for several seconds. Finally, she looked at the social worker. "Ms. Jennings?" The young woman shuffled through notes. We have preliminary indications of emotional deprivation consistent with long-term neglect, Your Honor. No bruises, no physical harm, but the child displays signs of detachment, hypervigilance, and guilt associated with basic care. She was never denied food, Thomas's lawyer cut in sharply. No, Ms. Jennings agreed, but she was denied presence, affection, connection. And that leaves marks too, just not on the skin. Sophie turned her face away, as if ashamed that her wounds weren't visible enough. Mark suddenly leaned forward. Your Honor, may I request a brief recess? On what grounds? The judge asked. He stood. On human ones. Amelia Vaughn studied him, then nodded once. 15 minutes later, Sophie sat on a bench just outside the courtroom. She rested her head against Elena's shoulder. I didn't know Ms. Rivers remembered me, she whispered. Elena smiled softly. She didn't forget. Some people never do. Sophie tilted her face up. Is it okay that I sang that song, even though it makes me sad? It's more than okay, Elena said. That's how healing begins. Not by pretending we don't hurt, but by finding places safe enough to say that we do. When they returned to the courtroom, the air felt different. Not lighter, but less cold. Judge Vaughn adjusted her glasses. Given the testimony and evidence presented, the court acknowledges that while no criminal abuse has been committed, the environment in question may constitute emotional neglect under Oregon Statute 419B005. The court will order continued temporary placement with the Whitakers for the next 90 days, pending therapeutic review and parental participation in restorative care. Thomas didn't flinch. Sophie looked up. Mr. Parker, the judge continued, do you understand these terms? He nodded. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. May I request visitation under supervised conditions? His voice cracked. Not enough to notice unless you were listening closely. Sophie stared at him, unsure if she was supposed to feel something. But she didn't. Not anger, not hope. Only the dull ache of someone who had cried too long in silence. As the courtroom emptied, Sophie glanced back one last time at Ms. Rivers. The woman waved. Sophie didn't wave back, not because she didn't want to, but because she was afraid it would make her cry again. But in her pocket, she clutched something new, a folded napkin with the words, Your voice matters, written in Danielle's familiar looped handwriting. And for the first time in years, Sophie began to believe it just might be true. The cafe on the corner of Main Street and Riverside in downtown Medford wasn't remarkable. Mismatched mugs, a chalkboard menu, and quiet jazz on the speakers. But it had big windows, the kind that let in afternoon light, and Sophie liked that. It made the world feel less small. It was Sunday afternoon, and the Whitakers had brought her here as a reward. Not for good behavior, not for finishing homework, but simply for making it through the week. Because surviving the truth is brave, Elena had said. Mark stirred his coffee slowly while Elena ordered at the counter. Sophie sat across from him, fidgeting with a napkin. He didn't speak at first, just watched her draw. She wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe because she didn't have her sketchbook, or maybe because the moment felt quiet in the good kind of way. On the napkin, she drew a tiny figure, a girl with her arms stretched outward, standing between two towering brick walls. Above the left wall, she wrote in shaky capital letters, Rules. Over the right, Hopes. She didn't notice Mark leaning forward until he asked softly, Can I see? Sophie hesitated, then turned the napkin toward him. Mark studied the image. You draw like someone who sees more than most people do. I just draw what's already there, she whispered. He tapped the wall labeled rules. These, were they yours or someone else's? My dad's, she said without blinking. There were rules for everything: how to sit, how to eat, when to speak. And this side? Mark asked, gesturing toward the wall marked hopes. She paused. Things I wanted to say, but I never did. Because I didn't want to lose him completely. Mark nodded. He didn't rush the silence that followed. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. When I was your age, my dad told me that boys don't cry. Once, when I scraped my leg falling off my bike, he made me ride it again before I could go inside. I thought he was teaching me strength, but now, I think he just didn't know how to hold pain. Sophie looked up. Did he ever change? Mark exhaled slowly. No, but I did. They sat quietly for a while, the only sounds the hum of a milk frother behind the counter and the clink of teaspoons. Sophie picked up her pencil again and added something to the drawing. A tiny crack at the base of the rules wall, as if something had started to shift. Then she looked at Mark and asked, If I stay kind in a home with no kindness, does that make me strong or foolish? Mark leaned forward, both elbows on the table. It makes you extraordinary. But even extraordinary people get tired. You deserve to be kind in a place where kindness lives. Sophie didn't smile, but her shoulders relaxed. When Elena returned with 2 warm muffins and a peppermint tea, she noticed the napkin. That's beautiful, she said gently. May I keep it? Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. I think I want to show it to the judge. Mark and Elena exchanged a glance. You're allowed to do that, Elena said. But only if it's what you want. I think... Sophie swallowed. I think I want people to understand what it's like to live in the middle. That night, back home, Sophie taped the napkin drawing above her bed. It fluttered slightly when the window was open. She didn't say much about it, but Mark noticed her eyes drift toward it every time someone asked how she was feeling. Later that week, they visited Sophie's therapist, Ms. Rivera, a gentlewoman with big earrings and a bigger smile. She asked Sophie to bring something meaningful to the session. Sophie brought the napkin. Ms. Rivera studied it carefully. Do you feel trapped between these two things? I used to, Sophie said. But now I think the wall on the right, hopes, is where I want to live. The other one's just heavy. Ms. Rivera nodded. Sometimes we build those walls ourselves, but sometimes they're built for us, and it takes time to realize we can choose what to keep. Sophie looked up. Is it okay to still love my dad, even if I don't want to live with him? Ms. Rivera's expression softened. That's not just okay, Sophie. That's honest. Love and safety don't always live in the same place, but it's brave to say when they don't. That evening, Sophie wrote a letter. Not to send, not yet, but just to write. Dear Dad, I know you didn't mean to hurt me. I think maybe you thought being quiet was the best way to be strong, but it made me feel invisible. Sometimes I pretended the rabbit could talk so someone would say, good job, when I brushed my teeth or did my math. I don't want to be afraid of silence anymore. I don't want to earn love like a sticker chart. I want a home where it's okay to be messy and loud and sad sometimes. I still love you, but I don't want to live between 2 walls forever. Sophie. She folded the letter and slid it into a book on her nightstand. Later that night, Mark found her sitting at the kitchen table again, this time with a blank piece of paper in front of her. Another napkin? He asked gently. No, she said. I'm making new walls. Ones I get to build myself. What will they say? Sophie picked up her pencil and, with steady strokes, wrote across the top, "Things I want to keep." Underneath, she began to list them. The way Elena says "sweetheart" without trying too hard. Mark's pancakes that are never the same shape. Ms. Rivers' scarf that smells like cinnamon. The peppermint tea from the cafe. A house with music. A home where you can cry and still be welcome at the table. When she finished, she looked at Mark and asked, "Will the judge listen to things like this?" "She should," he said. "And even if she doesn't, I will. Always." Sophie didn't cry, but for the first time she believed she didn't need to, just to be seen. She folded the paper next to the drawing and placed both into a small folder labeled "For Court." And for the first time in her life, Sophie Parker didn't feel like a problem to be solved. She felt like a person who could speak. The night rain came down in wild sheets, rattling the gutters and drumming against the windows like 1,000 whispered thoughts that never got said out loud. The air smelled like soaked earth and old leaves, and somewhere in the distance, a wind chime rang out of rhythm. Sophie sat quietly in the back seat of the county van as it climbed the familiar hill toward her father's home. She had been silent most of the ride, clutching the folder containing her drawing and her new list. Her fingers left smudges on the manila paper, but she didn't care. It was hers. Her voice, finally on paper. Mark rode beside her, calm but watchful. He knew this wasn't just a visit. It was a test. A 10-day supervised return to the house on the hill to see if Thomas Parker could change, if he could become a father in more than just the biological sense. Thomas met them at the door. He nodded at Mark without warmth, then turned to his daughter. "Hello, Sophie," he said evenly. "Hi," she answered, her voice thin. The house looked exactly the same. Pristine, predictable, cold. Dinner was already laid out. Brown rice, steamed broccoli, grilled salmon arranged with mathematical precision. Sophie stared at her plate. She was hungry, but the food felt unfamiliar. It had no story, no aroma that wrapped around you. Just nutrition, served without eye contact. Halfway through the meal, Thomas asked, "How is school?" "It's okay," Sophie said. "What unit are you in?" "Fractions." He nodded. "Are you ahead of your peers?" Sophie pressed her lips together. She wanted to say that her drawing had been pinned to the classroom wall, or that Ms. Rivers let her help tune the classroom guitar, but she knew none of that would matter to him. He only cared about measurable outcomes. Later that evening, as the storm intensified, Sophie curled up in her childhood bed and stared at the ceiling fan. It hadn't changed. Neither had the rules posted on the closet door. 1. Complete all tasks before leisure. 2. Emotions must be managed privately. 3. No interrupting. 4. Earn everything. She turned her face to the wall. The stuffed rabbit lay next to her, too clean for comfort. It didn't smell like cinnamon or couch pillows or Mark's hospital soap. It smelled like bleach. At midnight, lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating her room in flashes. Thunder followed, and with it, the sound of a glass shattering somewhere downstairs. Sophie jumped up, heart pounding. She tiptoed out of her room and crept down the hallway. In the kitchen, Thomas stood frozen in front of the sink, a broken glass at his feet, and milk running slowly across the tile like it was trying to escape. She froze. Her whole body tensed, not because of the mess, but because of the memory. The last time she had broken a glass, he hadn't yelled. He hadn't even looked angry. He had simply stopped speaking to her for 3 days. Sophie opened her mouth, then closed it. Thomas reached for paper towels with slow, deliberate movements. He was about to kneel down when she stepped forward and said, too quickly, "It's okay. I can clean it." He looked up sharply. "You should be asleep." "I know, but I heard it." She grabbed a towel from the counter. "It's just milk." He didn't stop her. She bent down and soaked the puddle. The glass was in large pieces. Nothing dangerous. She cleaned it the way Elena had taught her. Firm, steady, without fear. Then, as she wiped the last streak from the tile, she whispered, "I cleaned it, so now I still deserve dinner?" The words left her mouth before she could stop them. Thomas stared at her. Something shifted in his face. Barely, but it was there. He knelt down, not to pick up the glass, but to face her. "You don't have to earn dinner," he said. Sophie blinked. "But I used to." "I thought I was teaching you independence," he said quietly. "I thought love made you weak." She didn't answer. She didn't trust it yet. He reached out, then hesitated. "May I?" She nodded once. And for the first time in 3 years, Thomas Parker wrapped his arms around his daughter. Not a stiff pat, not a gesture for appearance, but a real embrace. Unsure, shaky, but real. Sophie stood there, small and still in his arms, not knowing what to feel. She didn't cry, she didn't lean in, but she didn't pull away either. That alone was a beginning. The next morning he made toast, burnt it, tried again, got it right on the 3rd slice. He placed it in front of her with a tiny saucer of cinnamon sugar. Sophie stared. "It's Tuesday." "Yes." "You never let cinnamon on weekdays?" "I'm reconsidering some things," he said awkwardly. She picked up the toast and bit into it. Her lips twitched. "It's not as good as Mark's," she said. He almost smiled. "I'll keep trying." That day, Sophie drew another picture. Not a girl between walls, but a bridge. Small, crooked, with planks missing, but connecting 2 ledges. She left it on the table without saying anything. That night, she found it taped to the fridge. The call came on a Thursday afternoon. Elena was folding laundry when her phone buzzed with a number she recognized. The clerk from Jackson County Juvenile Court. She answered, listened, and didn't say much, just nodded slowly, as the voice on the other end explained that Judge Vaughn had requested a follow-up appearance. "There's been a development," the clerk said. "Sophie's therapist submitted new materials. The judge wants to hear from Sophie directly." When Elena hung up, Sophie was sitting on the living room rug, sketching in her notebook. She looked up instantly alert, the way children who have lived in emotional uncertainty often do, always bracing for disruption. "Court again?" she asked softly. Elena nodded. "But this time, Bo, they want to hear from you." Sophie didn't smile. She didn't frown either. She simply closed her notebook and whispered, "Okay." The courtroom looked smaller this time. Or maybe Sophie had grown in invisible ways since her last visit. She wore a dark blue dress with tiny stars along the hem, a gift from Mark on her 8th birthday last week. She clutched her rabbit tighter than usual, not for safety, but for grounding. Thomas Parker was already seated when they arrived. He stood when Sophie entered, not because anyone told him to, but because this time he thought maybe she deserved that much. Judge Vaughn leaned forward. "Miss Parker," she said gently, "we understand you've prepared something to share with us." Sophie stepped forward slowly. Her folder was clasped to her chest, worn at the edges. She placed it on the stand and opened it with care. Inside was the napkin drawing, her list from the kitchen table, and something new. A handwritten document titled Family Rules, Revised Edition. She cleared her throat. Her voice trembled, but she didn't look away. I used to live between two walls, she said. One with rules, one with hopes. The rules told me how to behave, how to sit, how to chew, how to be invisible. The hopes were everything I didn't say because I was scared saying them would make love go away. She paused, eyes flicking toward Thomas. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just listened. Then I went to live with Elena and Mark. At first I felt guilty for being happy, for liking pancakes and bedtime stories and saying goodnight out loud. But I started to understand something. Love isn't something you have to earn. She lifted the page titled Family Rules, Revised. I made these for the court, for myself, and maybe for my dad, too. She read them clearly. Rule 1. Love is not a reward. Rule 2. Feelings are not mistakes. Rule 3. Time together is not earned. It's shared. The courtroom was utterly still. I don't want my dad punished, she added. I want him helped. But I can't go back to silence. She looked directly at Judge Vaughn now, and her voice, small as it was, filled the space. I want to live in a house where it's okay to ask questions, to spill milk, to be hugged. I want to live where my voice matters. Judge Vaughn folded her hands together. Sophie, thank you for your courage. That was not only brave, it was deeply human. The judge turned to Thomas. Mr. Parker, have you reviewed the therapist's report? I have, he said. And? I agree with it, he said. I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought I was preparing her for the world by making her tough. But I forgot to give her the one thing that makes toughness possible: belonging. The room held its breath. I want to try again, he added. Not just as her father, but as someone willing to be re-taught. Judge Vaughn nodded slowly. The law does not often deal well with emotional wounds, but today I believe we are not dealing with a custody case. We are witnessing a family, fractured, but perhaps repairable. She paused, eyes moving between father and daughter. I am ordering continued joint supervision for the next 90 days, shared weekends, required therapy, emotional parenting course. Full reintegration is not granted yet, but it is open for possibility. Sophie looked down at her rabbit, then up at her father. He wasn't smiling, but for the first time, he looked reachable. As the court adjourned, Thomas walked toward Sophie slowly. I read your new rules, he said. I have a few to add, if you'll let me. She blinked. Like what? He took out a folded sheet of paper from his coat pocket. Rule 4, he said. Mistakes are not reasons to disappear. Rule 5. Hugs can happen even when no one earns them. Rule 6. Silence is for sleeping, not for punishing. Sophie stared at the paper. You wrote these? I had help, he admitted. Ms. Rivera made me talk about my own father. I didn't like it, but I think I needed it. She nodded slowly. We can tape them next to mine. And for the first time since her mother died, father and daughter walked out of a courtroom side by side, not fixed, not perfect, but no longer silent. The walls of the Oregon Family Wellness Center were painted a soft sage green, the color of calm. In the waiting room, the chairs didn't match. The art on the walls was hand-drawn by children, and a basket of stuffed animals sat by the bookshelf like silent sentries guarding the heart of the place. Thomas Parker sat stiffly in the corner, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He wasn't used to this kind of space, places that allowed messiness, that accepted tears without fixing them. He wore his usual navy sweater and slacks, as if logic could still protect him. But his eyes were less sharp now, more tired, more willing. Sophie sat 3 chairs away, reading a paperback about a girl who trained birds. She didn't speak, but her foot tapped softly against the linoleum floor. Every few minutes, she looked at her dad, not accusingly, not fearfully, just watching. At 10:03, the group facilitator appeared, a woman named Dana Klein, middle-aged, warm-eyed, with a voice like dusk. "We're ready for you both," she said. Inside the therapy room, the chairs formed a circle. 4 other parent-child pairs were already seated, a young dad and a boy who refused to make eye contact, a grandmother and a teen with earbuds in, a mother who kept twisting a tissue, and a boy who wore 2 watches but wouldn't speak. No one smiled. No one needed to. Dana gestured for Thomas and Sophie to sit together. "We begin," she said, "by not pretending." There was no formal introduction, no pressure to share, just space. For a long while, the only sounds were breathing and the soft creak of chairs. Then the boy with the watches whispered, "I didn't know it hurt her." And his mother cried. Thomas sat motionless, as if still learning the rules of this new country where pain had a voice. Later, Dana invited the group to an exercise. Each child writes a sentence they've always wanted to say out loud. Each parent writes one they've never dared to say back. Sophie hesitated, then wrote, "Why wasn't I enough to make you stay in the room?" Thomas stared at the blank paper in front of him. He didn't move for a full minute. Then, in block letters, he wrote, "I didn't know how to love through noise." They traded slips. Sophie read his sentence 3 times, her lips moving silently. When she looked up, her father was already looking at her. That afternoon, Thomas spoke for the first time in group. "I thought silence was safe," he said slowly. "I was raised by a man who believed that feelings were flaws. I became him without meaning to. I thought I was protecting my daughter by teaching her to be strong, but I wasn't building strength. I was building solitude." His voice cracked. Sophie reached over, not to hold his hand, but to place her rabbit in his lap. The group fell silent. Dana smiled but said nothing. Some things didn't need commentary. The next session, they were asked to bring a symbol from home, something that represented what they wanted to rebuild. Sophie brought the original napkin drawing, now wrinkled and worn. She unfolded it with care, smoothing the creases. Thomas brought the rabbit. "This time," he said, "I carried it." He held it out like an offering, and Sophie took it back, gently, without resistance. On the way home, they stopped for hot chocolate. Not because it was a holiday, not because someone earned it, but just because. Sophie sat across from him in the corner booth, watching the steam rise. "I didn't know you had a father," she said quietly. Thomas nodded. He wasn't a kind man. He believed attention was indulgence. "Do you think you're becoming him?" she asked. He shook his head. "I think I was, but I'm not anymore." She stared at her cup. "Sometimes I forget to talk, even when I feel safe." "That's okay," he said. "Sometimes I forget how to listen." She looked up, surprised. He smiled. "We can practice." That night, in their new routine, Thomas didn't just tuck her in. He stayed, in the chair by the bed, reading from a book she picked. He stumbled on the voices. He got the owl sound wrong. But she didn't correct him. She just listened. Halfway through the second chapter, she interrupted. Dad? Yes? It's okay if you cry. It doesn't make you weak. He didn't answer right away. Then, voice quiet. It makes me safe? She nodded, eyes wide. It makes me safe, too. And with that, the hug happened. Not because someone planned it, not because it was deserved or timed, but because history sometimes changes in the quietest moments, when a child gives permission and a father finally lets go of armor. He hugged her, full, trembling, real. And in that single, silent gesture, generations of coldness cracked. The hug didn't erase the past, but it rewrote the future. Sophie had never made a list like this before. It wasn't for homework or groceries or chores. It wasn't something her dad had assigned or her therapist had suggested. It came to her one quiet afternoon when the clouds outside the bedroom window were stacked like cushions, and the house, for once, felt still in the way safe places do. She took out a yellow sheet of paper and wrote across the top, in her neatest handwriting, "People I can call if I'm scared." The first name she wrote was Officer Rachel Monroe, because Rachel had been the first to kneel down, the first to hear her without blinking, without rushing, without telling her to stop. Next came Ms. Danielle Rivers, her music teacher, because Danielle had played her voice for the courtroom and reminded everyone that bruises can exist in sound, not just skin. Then the Whitakers, Elena and Mark, because they never treated her like a guest. They'd left the porch light on every night she was gone. They'd saved the napkin drawing. Mark still sent her goofy voicemails just to say, "Toast is still terrible without you." Fourth was Mrs. Abernathy, the older neighbor next door who smelled like gardenias and always offered tea even if you didn't drink it. Because the first time Thomas forgot Sophie's umbrella, it was Mrs. Abernathy who quietly handed one over with a wink and a hard candy. Sophie hesitated before writing the fifth name. Then she wrote, "Dad," and next to it in parentheses, "when we've both had time to breathe." She smiled a little. Not because everything was perfect, but because she finally had a choice. She folded the list twice, then taped it above her bed with blue painter's tape. Below it, she added a second title, "Places I Can Go When I Need to Feel Okay." And under that, the window seat, the school music room, under the tree near the park bridge, the cafe on Main with peppermint tea, the right side of the couch next to Dad. When the room feels gentle, she read the whole thing aloud, once, softly, and didn't feel ridiculous at all. Later that week, Sophie brought the list to her therapist, Ms. Rivera. They read through it together. When they reached the part about her dad, Rivera paused. "You wrote this yourself?" Sophie nodded. Rivera looked at her. "Do you know what this is?" Sophie tilted her head. "It's a boundary, a beautiful one. And more than that, it's a map of who makes you feel seen and where you remember how to breathe." Sophie thought about that all day. That night, her dad overcooked the pasta. The sauce was too salty, and he dropped a fork on the floor. Years ago, a mistake like that might have turned the room into ice, followed by 2 days of silence and controlled breathing. But tonight, he laughed. "Epic fail. Shall we order pizza?" Sophie hesitated. The pasta wasn't great, but it wasn't awful. "I'll eat it," she said. "But you owe me one bedtime story with full voices." He saluted. "Deal." They sat on the couch that evening, Sophie on the right, where she felt most at ease. The space between them had shrunk slowly over the past few weeks, inch by inch, not forced, just chosen. Halfway through the story, Sophie asked, Do you think healing means forgetting? Thomas stopped mid-sentence. No, he said. I think healing means remembering safely. Sophie nodded. So I can keep the list? He looked at her, puzzled. Of course. I mean, I don't have to erase people just because we had hard parts? He set the book down. Sophie, I think some of the bravest people are the ones who don't throw away their stories. They just rewrite the endings. The next afternoon, they argued for the first time in weeks. It was about bedtime. Sophie wanted to stay up late to finish a drawing. Thomas said no. His voice was firmer than usual, and Sophie felt the tension in her chest rise like old smoke. I said no, he repeated. It's getting late. You don't have to sound like that, she snapped. You're doing it again. He froze. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't mean to make you feel like you couldn't talk. But Sophie wasn't ready to talk yet. Not with the old fear pressing in, not with her throat burning. I'm going to my room now, she said. I'll talk. When we both feel safe again. She walked away. He didn't follow. She closed the door gently. Not slammed. Just shut. Then she sat on her bed, looked at the list taped above her headboard, and felt something astonishing. She wasn't scared. She wasn't frozen. She was grounded. For the first time in her life, Sophie Parker knew how to protect herself. Not with silence, not with shrinking, but with words and breath and space. Half an hour later, there was a knock on her door. She opened it slowly. Thomas stood with 2 mugs of warm milk, one with cinnamon, one plain. I thought maybe we could start over, he said. Sophie looked at him, then stepped aside and let him in. They sat on the floor together, cross-legged, sipping quietly. I didn't like how I said no, Thomas admitted. I sounded like old me. Sophie smiled faintly. Yeah, you did. I'll do better next time. I'll remind you if you forget, she said. He grinned. Deal. That night, she added one more name to the list, me. Because now she knew. When fear came, or silence pressed, or the room felt too loud to stay, she had someone inside who would speak and listen and keep her safe, herself. The third-grade auditorium at Jefferson Elementary smelled like crayons, orange slices, and too much hairspray. Folding chairs lined the gymnasium floor in crooked rows, and a banner hung slightly askew above the small stage. Growing hearts and growing minds. Class of 3rd grade. Parents clutched phones. Teachers dabbed at their eyes. It was the last day of school, and the world, at least in this little Oregon town, felt like it was collectively exhaling. Sophie stood behind the curtain, wearing a light blue dress with tiny embroidered suns along the hem. Her rabbit was tucked into her backpack, watching from the wings. She held a note card in her hands, though she knew every word by heart. Her name had been chosen for the closing remarks. Not because she had the highest grades or the loudest voice, but because she had asked if she could. Not in front of everyone, not even out loud. She had slipped a note under Ms. Hawthorne's door that said, "If we're saying thank yous, I have something to say, too." Ms. Hawthorne, who'd been her homeroom teacher all year, didn't hesitate. Now, the curtain opened, and Sophie stepped into the light. She looked small under the gymnasium spotlights, her brown hair pulled into a soft braid, her shoes scuffed but proud. There was a murmur in the crowd, those who knew her story, those who didn't, and then silence. She stepped to the microphone. "My name is Sophie Parker," she began. I used to be quiet because I thought being quiet kept you safe. But now I know. You don't have to be silent to be strong. The crowd leaned in. I want to thank Ms. Hawthorne for showing me that mistakes are part of growing. I want to thank Ms. Rivers for reminding me that songs count as stories. I want to thank Officer Rachel, even though she's not here, because she listened the first time I asked a really hard question. In the third row, Elena wiped her eyes. Mark reached over and took her hand. Sophie paused, then took a deep breath. And I want to thank my dad. There was a hush. Everyone knew. He's here today, she said. And we're learning how to be a family again. We didn't always get it right. But we're writing new rules. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This is our list, she said. We made it together. She read aloud, clearly, carefully. 1. Love is not a reward. 2. Feelings are not mistakes. 3. Time together is not earned. It's shared. 4. Mistakes are not reasons to disappear. 5. Hugs don't need permission slips. 6. Silence is for sleeping, not punishment. The room held its breath. Sophie looked down for a moment, then back up. Some kids need to know that being sad doesn't make them bad, that being afraid doesn't mean they're wrong, that being loved doesn't have to be earned. A few people wiped their eyes. Others nodded. But in the back row, Thomas Parker stood straighter than he ever had in his life. Not rigid, not armored, but present. He was wearing jeans. The first time in 30 years. When the applause began, it wasn't loud. It was soft, warm, rising like morning light. Sophie stepped down from the stage. Ms. Hawthorne met her with a quiet hug. No words, just pride. Outside, the grass was still damp from last night's rain. Families spilled onto the field with cupcakes and laughter. The scent of sunscreen and summer clung to everything. Sophie sat on the picnic blanket beneath the oak tree, nibbling a piece of strawberry cake. Her dad sat beside her, knees crossed awkwardly, trying to keep frosting off his shirt. You were incredible, he said. You didn't cry, did you? She teased. Only a little, he said, clearing his throat. But I'm blaming the gym lights. She laughed, then pulled something from her backpack, a small wooden frame. Inside was the napkin drawing, the same one, a little crumpled, but now surrounded by a wide white mat. Beneath it, she had written in black pen, "The girl who stood between rules and hopes and built a bridge." She handed it to him. It's for your desk, she said. He looked at it, then at her. Do you still feel like you're in the middle? She shook her head. No, not anymore. I moved. To where? She pointed to his heart, then to hers. That evening, they sat on the porch steps, watching the sun dip low over the neighborhood. The sky turned lavender and gold. A gentle wind rustled the chimes on Mrs. Abernathy's porch. Thomas held a mug of tea. Sophie leaned her head on his arm. Do you think people can really change? She asked. I didn't, he said, until I watched you do it first. She smiled. Do you want to hear something funny? He asked. Always. I signed up to help at the school garden this summer. She blinked. You hate dirt. I'm learning, he said. Mark gave me gloves. She giggled. They sat in silence for a while, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was whole. When the porch light clicked on, Sophie turned to him. "I think I want to help other kids like me," she said. "Maybe start a club, or write a book, or a song, something with rules, but the right kind." He nodded. "I think you already have." The rabbit sat between them, patched and mended, a little worn from being loved. And as the sky darkened, the porch filled with the softest sound, not music, not talking, just presence. Enough to know that love had finally unpacked its bags and decided to stay. Thank you for staying until the end of Sophie's journey, a little girl who reminded us that sometimes healing begins with being heard and a genuine hug. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe so we can keep sharing more warm, hopeful stories like this one. See you in the next chapter.